think that's a little more professional now. All right.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I think it's 8:01. We'll get started. So hello everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar on pharmaconutrition and health. I'm Dr. Charlotte Norton, and I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Paul Clayton to the webinar this evening. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Clayton. I know you are sort of a pioneer in leading the study of the pharmacological effects of food, looking at how they affect our bodies and how they affect performance. So it's great to have you with us this evening to talk through such a exciting and interesting topic.
I'm ready to be grilled.
Grilled. Well, hopefully it will be not too much of a grilling. We're all looking forward to learning from you. I think we've got a mix of attendees this evening. We've got some people looking at it from being practitioners who are interested in how they can help improve their patients' health, and I know that there are some people who are patients or people considering how they can improve their health as well. So we've got a mix of different types of attendees this evening. So thank you to those who've joined us, and please do use the chat function if you have any questions. I'm more than happy to put forward any questions to Dr. Clayton that you may have as we go through the webinar. So as I said, it's great to have you with us, and I'm sure I've only done a very, very brief introduction to you, Dr. Clayton. So I wondered if you'd start off telling us a little bit about your background and how you got into the field of pharmaconutrition and the work you're doing currently.
Well, I studied at Edinburgh University, and I went to medical school there, and that's a long time ago. It was in the 60s. And at that time, Edinburgh Medical School was considered to be one of the better ones, maybe one of the best ones. And I had a really enjoyable time. I loved the preclinical aspects of it. And then I branched sideways. I did very well there and was invited to do a BSc Honours year and then a PhD. And so I moved sideways, further and further away from medical practice into clinical pharmacology. And even at that very early stage, I was beginning to become disillusioned with the orthodox medical model, because it was very clear to me that while we were developing all kinds of pharmaceutical tools that we could use to manage the symptoms of disease, the entire Pasteurian magic bullet model, focusing on specific enzymes and receptors, was not really very well suited to doing anything other than managing symptoms. It was, again, very clear, even half a century ago, that the chronic degenerative diseases, which have become so very common, are largely due to not single point errors, but to multiple metabolic imbalances, which are driven in turn by a whole range of nutritional imbalances. And trying to rectify this sprawling, unwieldy mess with a single magic bullet was philosophically deeply flawed. And it was, in fact, in philosophical terms, it was a prisoner, this whole concept of where the pharmaceutical science began, which was in the management of infectious disorders. And so I did very well. I graduated summa cum laude. So I was arguably one of the better students in one of the better universities. And I was supposed to progress seamlessly up the academic ladder, and I was told that, well, there's a chair waiting for you, my boy. And it was, I was flattered, but I had got to the point where it just didn't make very much sense to me anymore. And so I rewarded my mentors and teachers, who I now look back on with great fondness, by dropping out. And I left the university, and I didn't even go physically to my graduation. This was still the 60s and the 70s. So dropping out was okay, sort of. And I did all kinds of other things. But even although I was making a living as a film director, working for the government, doing all sorts of different things, I never lost an interest in this relationship between diet and health, and the way in which dietary changes over time manifested themselves in changes in the public health profile of a nation or a culture. And I want to contradict you. You introduced me as one of the pioneers in this area. I wasn't. People had been looking into the pharmacological attributes of foods and food extracts long before I got on the scene. But I think perhaps I was the first person to begin to look at it in a systematic way and to try and take all these little pieces of information and build a kind of a map, an outline of this dark continent, which culminated in what I regard now as a rather childish book called Health Defense, which amazingly is still in print, although I do think it's largely obsolete. But it was an attempt to take all this science and say, well, look, this is what the shape of this science looks like. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, whatever, it didn't matter what I was doing, the science kept on pulling me back. And after having done lots of different things and worked in many different countries for many different companies and actually for a few governments, I was working for a small company in Norway, a very small company, who were producing a product called Oil for Life. It was a combination of marine omega-3s and olive oil. And it was based on the work of a group of scientists, mostly Scandinavian. Eilertsen is one very well-known one. Osterud is another. Really good scientists who'd been looking at the synergistic effects of these actives on inflammatory disorders. And so Oil for Life, this company, this small company, produced a product. They had a dried blood spot test, which they bracketed with it. And they asked me to come and advise them. And I was really interested in doing that because I had been diagnosed several years before that with Graves' disease after a period of incredible stress in my life. And that really taught me very vividly how it is that stress can make you sick. I know exactly how this problem occurred. And I thought, well, after I'd been diagnosed, you know, I was absolutely typical case. The only symptom I didn't have was exophthalmos, but everything else. So I just woke up one morning, I'd lost weight. I woke up one morning with atrial fibrillation and walked down to the hospital because my lower heart is very strong. And they promptly put me in the ICU and did all the diagnostic stuff. So I had Graves' disease. And they said, well, we will have to wait. We'll calm it down. And then eventually what we'll do is we'll destroy the thyroid. And then you'll be on thyroid hormone replacement therapy for the rest of your life. And I wasn't very enthusiastic about that. And my feeling was, well, maybe I can stop my immune system from doing the damage. And if I can silence it for long enough, maybe it'll forget its target. And this was really just a guess, a wild guess. So I was actually drinking large amounts of fish oil and olive oil, not in a blend, but raw. And it was this horrible thing to do.
I imagine very unpalatable.
I did not enjoy it. But I didn't want to really be permanently in receipt of thyroxine. And it was also just a voyage of intellectual curiosity. Yeah. And after keeping my immune system very, very damped, first of all, the symptomology diminished and then disappeared. And I kept it that way for, I think, about 3-4 months. And then gradually removed this intervention to see what had happened. And to my joy and my surprise, my immune system had forgotten its target. It had effectively been reprogrammed. And that's 15 years ago now. And I went back to the hospital a long time back and they had my records and they said, well, yeah, you've got Graves, how's your condition? And I said, well, I don't have it anymore. And they said, well, that doesn't happen. The textbooks say that autoimmune disease doesn't go away. Well, the textbooks are wrong in so many instances. And history, and the history of medicine in particular, is revisionism. We're constantly updating our views on how actually things work. And we look back to the previous generation and we think how deluded and how barbaric their medical practice was. And the next generation will think the same way about us.
Yeah.
And so along came Zinzino. They swallowed up this tiny company and I was part of the office furniture. I got swallowed up by this whale. And at some point I had a meeting with the CEO and the MD, and they said, would you like to work for us now? And I said, okay, well, what's the brief? And they said, well, just do the best you can, because they'd been reading bits about me and they knew that I was interested in pharmaconutrition. And in all the companies and governments and everyone else that I've ever worked for, I'd never had a brief quite like that before. So I said, okay, I think I can transform you into a life science company. Because when I first met them, they'd been selling coffee of all things.
Yeah, totally different spectrum.
But, you know, they had a vision and it overlapped with mine. And so we started working on this very small portfolio. They had this balance oil. And then I developed Extend and Xenobiotic and a couple of other things. Now, can I just step back from the detail for the moment and put this in a larger context?
Yeah, of course. Please do.
Okay, I have to cite Barry Popkin here, and he is really an important figure in this whole area of nutritional science. And I can see you know who that is. He's, oddly enough, he's an agricultural economist, and he works at the Population Center in North Carolina. I think he's still there. In about 1993 or 94, he first started publishing papers about something he called the nutrition transition. And by that, what he was describing was a phenomenon that he'd seen in every country which had moved away from a traditional diet to a modern diet, which includes more and more ultra-processed foods. In a very short period of time, you see an enormous increase in the chronic degenerative non-communicable diseases, an enormous increase. They increase in frequency, they decrease in latency. So you're seeing them occurring in younger and younger age groups. And this is absolutely indicative of a population that is being poisoned. And this gave rise to the idea, diseases of civilization. Now that's a nice romantic concept, but it doesn't get you anywhere because it's insufficiently granular to allow you to try to develop antidotes. As a pharmacologist, I wanted to know, how does the modern diet and lifestyle make us sick? And can we counter those pathological vectors, whatever they are? And after walking around the problem a large number of times, it became evident that the modern diet and lifestyle do four basic things which make us so sick. It creates chronic inflammatory stress, and everybody knows about that. It's been in Time and Newsweek, and there's even television programs about it. And yep, that's a part of the story. It's important, but it's just one of four. There are four nutritional horsemen of this particular apocalypse. So chronic inflammatory stress is one. The next one is type B malnutrition, because this same diet, which is very pro-inflammatory, is also full of empty calories, which means there's a lot of calories there which contain no nutritional value whatsoever. And it's astonishing when you add the calories up. What you find is that the number of calories people consume in the form of sugar and plant oils account for almost a third of their total calorific intake. So that's a third of the food that they eat has almost no or zero nutrients or nutritional value other than calorific. Looked at in another way, it's as if you spent January, February, March, and April eating nothing but sugar and oil. So everyone is got chronic inflammatory stress. At the same time, they're starving. So the chronic inflammatory stress is accelerating the breakdown of tissue. This type B malnutrition slows down your ability to repair and heal. So you are overall, you are catabolic. There's a progressive net loss of healthy tissue, which is very much the core, it's the hallmark of many chronic degenerative diseases. So those are two of the horsemen. Then there's the third, which is dysbiosis, because this post-transitional diet is very low in prebiotic fibers, leading to a grossly abnormal microbiota, which people refer to as microbiome, which is predominantly gram-negative, really overwhelmingly gram-negative.
Yes. Not
a good idea. Not all gram-negative bugs are bad, but the whole thing about being gram-negative, it denotes a bacterium where the cell wall is consisting of lipopolysaccharide, which is highly pro-inflammatory. And a lot of these bacteria like to eat mucin. So they destroy the mucosal layers that lay over the colonocytes, and they come into contact with the colonocytes. Wham, serious chronic inflammatory stress, leaky gut, problems locally and everywhere else. So that's something you can rectify if you put in a very carefully designed blend of prebiotic fibers where you're calculating fermentation rates, therapeutic indices, colonic transit times. It's actually quite a complex calculation. And then you end up with a kind of slow fermentation that starts in the ascending colon and carries all the way through the descending colon to the rectal flexure. And at that point, that third horseman has been stopped in its tracks. The fourth is this really problematic combination of a diet which has an excessive glycemic load and index as well, but that's a slightly different thing, in a huge glycemic load and insufficient levels of physical activity. So you've got vast rivers of glucose entering the blood and there's nowhere to soak them up because the liver is not a very good sink. And that leads to hypoglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, more inflammatory stress, accelerated aging, and a whole raft of delayed complications. So what I set myself out to do was to devise a countermeasure to each one of those vectors, which is the health protocol.
Yes.
And when you put that in place, you're effectively taking your nutritional status back to a pre-transitional age. And at that point, chronic inflammatory stress is gone, dysbiosis is gone. Your body actually has all the cofactors that it needs, all the catalysts it needs to heal and regenerate. And if you then also do things like eating less carbs, digestible carbs, taking more exercise, and you can tweak that as well. There are interesting tweaks to that as well. You've neutralized the four horsemen. And now a lot of what we think of as the aging process disappears. And it slows down entirely. We have a large number of people who are following this regime now, and they are so odd. They are so unlike anybody else. I mean, they're like inhabitants of a blue zone. They're living in the modern world, but,
the blues,
but internally, they're blue zone people. And you can see that when they get onto this regime, they very quickly become less pharmaceutically dependent, and many of them become totally pharmaceutically independent. And this is such an odd profile in this day and age that the biobanking community are starting to look at it and thinking, this is really an atypical group. This is really interesting. We want to know what's happening. So we're now starting to talk to them and finding out, trying to develop ways in which we can study our abnormally healthy population more intensively. A long answer to a short question. I'm sorry. I talk too much.
No, a fantastic answer, and really, really interesting. I very much like your apocalyptic four horsemen approach. I think that is a really nice way to explain a lot of the key pillars that underline a lot of disease that we see. Obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm within obesity management, and we've probably got people here from different walks of medicine, and it underlies, in my practice, some, as you said, the sort of the culmination of all those things come together, and sadly you do see younger and younger people who are their disease span part of their life is becoming much progressively much longer.
Yes.
But I think one of the things that you touched on at the beginning of what you were saying, which I think underlies a lot of this, is actually the change in public health and the diet and lifestyle that so many of people, especially in the westernized world, in Northern Europe and the USA, sometimes fall into, that this can lead to these chronic, compound, you say, the four horsemen, and compound the chronic inflammation. I mean, what's your sort of views on the change in the food industry and the nutrition that people are taking on board these days?
I think that it isn't just a Western phenomenon anymore, because we are seeing exactly the same trends occurring disastrously in China and in India and in large parts of Africa. In other words, everywhere where the food multinationals and where this modern ultra-processed food revolution has gone. And I think that we have this iniquitous situation where these food companies are privatizing their profits and they're socializing their losses. They're not taking responsibility for the vast numbers of people that they're poisoning and killing. They fall on our shoulders, and they fall onto they become a burden for the healthcare system, for social services, and for everybody else. I don't think this situation is tenable, because if we allow it to continue, the increasing burden of ill health is absolutely swamping healthcare facilities everywhere in the world. It's not just a British problem. I know that there are issues in Britain, but it's also in America and everywhere else you look. We simply don't have enough resources or personnel to be able to maintain what is effectively a post hoc crisis management model of healthcare. We need to think more preventatively. And in order to do that, we need to bring these food companies to heel. I think they're actually committing a form of genocide. And what I am really disturbed by is the fact that I don't see any politicians anywhere who have the intellect and the backbone to identify this problem and to do anything about it.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Until those changes can occur or do occur, for the vast majority of people, they will remain under the influence of the food industry, and they will make bad choices, and sometimes not at their own fault, which is a real shame.
Absolutely not their own fault. I don't think it's helpful to blame consumers. The problem is that not everybody can be an expert in nutrition and health. And most people are in a food environment which is dominated by ultra-processed foods. And the reason for that is ultra-processed foods have higher profit margins, they've got longer shelf lives. They're all to do with branding and advertising. When I say long lives, they're shelf lives, not for the consumers. It actually shortens the lives of the consumers.
Yes, it does.
But the companies who produce these have a huge vested interest in making these foods delicious and cheap and addictive. And they've got to the point, they use bliss point technology to measure the palatability of their foods. And they have succeeded in creating a generation of foods which have many of the criteria of addictive substances. Mm-hmm. So I think that they're addictive, they taste good, everybody likes them, they're cheap, they're widely available, they don't satiate, so you eat more than you need to. And they get artificial, they're subsidized as well. I mean, don't you think it's odd that it's cheaper to buy a McDonald's hamburger than it is to buy a pound of good, fresh green beans or apples? And the reason is these companies are so powerful. They lobby the governments to subsidize the toxic crap that they sell. Now, there's some very, very good work that was done by Phil James, who used to run the Rowett Institute up at Aberdeen. And he and some other people did a kind of socioeconomic analysis of some of this. And they worked out that creating a food environment which was much, much healthier and which would result in dramatic reductions in health spending would be cost neutral. You simply take the subsidies away from the multinational food companies, and you take the same funding and you put it into growing more vegetables and fruits and cereals and things like that. But the problem is that these companies are so powerful, and I think you know who the major brand names are. Their pockets are so deep, their lobbying abilities are so pervasive, they own too many of our parliamentarians. So we're in this very toxic and damaging situation, and it's hard to see, given the current stakeholders, how we can move things forward. If you look at my blog, I shout and scream and hold my breath till I'm blue in the face. Yes. because I'm so furious about this situation. I think it's morally repugnant. I find it deeply offensive that we are killing so many people. We're making people ill. We're killing them before their time. Even worse than that, we are damaging the fetus in the womb. We're creating a generation of children that are arriving on this earth who already have brain damage. And that may seem like an outlandish claim, but in North America, which is a culture which consumes the highest number of their percentage of calories in the form of ultra-processed foods. In other words, they have the most pro-inflammatory, depleted diet. The official statistics say that 1 in 6 children now has mental illness. It's astonishing. It's appalling. It's appalling. We cannot afford to allow this to continue.
I would agree with you, and that is a very shocking statistic, especially when, to quote the name of one of your books, let food be your pharmaco-nutrition. Let just something simple as what you eat and what you put into your body can make such a significant difference to your health. It seems so simple, doesn't it, when we just sort of discuss it and say, just eat the right things, but it doesn't seem to be the practice that happens out there, which is, very frustrating. And I think for me, one of the things I've very much enjoyed about this Enzino Health Protocol, which you briefly touched on earlier, is the fact that I can give patients some education, I can help them adjust their diet, but I know that I can supplement them with the tools that they need to get them to a healthier place. So we haven't just got to rely on them, completely turning their diet around. We can make those sustainable and short-term changes, but we can bring in supplementation to help them, go the right direction, which is fantastic.
But what I would like to tell people as well, it isn't all about supplements. I think that there are some very simple things that people can do to improve their own health. And the first thing I would recommend most people do, well, after stopping smoking and taking a little bit of exercise, I mean, there's a lot of sense in those very basic steps, but there's not enough. The next thing that people should do, if they have the time and the wherewithal and the inclination, stop eating ultra-processed foods. So learn how to cook, learn how to work with basic produce, if you have time to do that. And it's just so important. And it would be such a simple way to reduce the calorific density, improve the nutritional density of the diet. And it would already, even something like that, would make a huge impact on public health.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a wealth of information out there. Again, with my practice with working with people that are overweight or obese, there's a wealth of information about how to go back to cooking the basics. And the COVID pandemic has even encouraged people to grow at home. Grow their own fruit and vegetables to rediscover food, rediscover the nutrition. So I absolutely agree with you that it should be a joined up approach, but. It's one of our responsibilities, I think, as clinicians, is to help spread that word, explain to our patients that we encounter, our family and our friends, the importance of this, and to really raise the profile, which hopefully everyone on the is enjoying finding out more about. I did just want to dive slightly into the health protocol because I wanted to talk through some of the products. But just before we do, we can see we have got a question here. So if it's okay with you, I'll put it to you. The question is, what is the rationale of fasting in the suppression of the body's inflammatory response?
I don't think that fasting in itself is absolutely necessary, to be quite honest. But you have to look at it in the context of where people are today, what their BMI is today, and what they're eating today. If you are overweight and obese, you are becoming more progressively pro-inflammatory anyway. So by losing weight, you're reducing inflammatory stress. If you're eating a contemporary diet, which is largely, if you're eating a lot of ultra-processed foods, it is already pro-inflammatory in different ways. By fasting, you're removing that pro-inflammatory factor as well. So those are two very basic things. If you were living, let's say, 150 years ago, and you were eating a really healthy diet, with high levels of anti-inflammatory compounds, immunomodulators, very small amounts of sugar, high octane alcohol, fried or pickled foods and things like that. If you're in that context, fasting is not going to help you at all.
Yeah, which makes absolute sense, really, because I know obviously some of my patients do use it or want to use fasting, intermittent fasting, as a tool to weight loss. But I hope that's answered your question. I can't see in the chat now who it was from, but I hope that answers your question there. Thank you for it.
Are we talking about fasting, intermittent fasting, or time-restricted eating?
Yeah, it would be great. I think I saw when it flashed up, it was from somebody on webinar. So if whoever asked the question, if you'd be happy to expand on that for us, that would be great. So we could make sure we've answered what it is that you were requesting. In the meantime, one of the things I wanted to go back into to talk a little bit about is the balance oil. Just which is one of the key components of the health protocol. I do have to admit, it wasn't that long ago that I understood or began to understand more about the importance of omega-3 and omega-6 balance at the cellular level. It wasn't something that I had absorbed during my medical education very well, and I found it extremely interesting. And then the more I've read into it, I can see sort of its application across the entire body. And I just wondered if you wouldn't mind telling everybody a little bit more about its importance and how we find ourselves so imbalanced quite often.
Okay, well, again, it's one of these areas where there's a simple answer, which is mostly true. But if you want the complete truth, I have to give you a more complex answer. The 6-to-3 ratio is important in the West. It's important in Europe and North America, but I don't think it's universally quite as important. I'll try to explain why. It doesn't really matter what kinds of fatty acids you have floating around in your plasma lipid profile, in the different fractions there. It's the fatty acids that have been incorporated into your cell membranes in the peripheral tissues. And the reason why the ratio of 6s and 3s is important there is because when you have been, you've made contact or with some sort of challenge, such as a microbe or, let's say, tissue damage, you need to be able to mount an inflammatory response. The acute inflammatory response is entirely, it's essential. It's part of your ability to interact with problems in the real world. And in order to do that, along comes an enzyme. It's quite a complex sequence, but at a certain point, this enzyme called PLA2 comes along and starts to chop up the phosphatidyl phospholipids that make up the bilipid cell membrane. And depending on how much 6s and how much 3s there are, this enzyme is going to release different amounts of omega-6 derivatives, and they're predominantly pro-inflammatory. Not all of them, but they're predominantly pro-inflammatory, or omega-3 compounds or mediators, which are predominantly, not all, but predominantly anti-inflammatory. So if you have the right ratio, which historically appears to be between 2-to-1 and 3-to-1 of 6s to 3s, under those conditions, you can mount an acute inflammatory response when you need to, but then once the challenge has been overcome or removed, you don't go on to have grumbling chronic inflammatory stress, which leads to the progressive destruction of healthy tissue. Fast forward, now it's 2000 or 2021, and because of the way in which the diet has changed, what we're now consuming is a ratio of 6 to 3, which is about 15-to-1 on average in Europe and about 25-to-1 in North America. That is clearly very pro-inflammatory. You're producing lots and lots of pro-inflammatory mediators, not enough of the anti-inflammatory mediators and the resolving mediators. Now you're going to have chronic inflammatory stress. Now, that's true in North America and in Europe. But the inflammatory cascade is quite a complex one. And the omega-6s and 3s they're sort of up here in the cascade, and down there, further down, there are other points of intervention. And that's where the polyphenols come in. The polyphenols and the omega-3s, they play complementary roles in many, many different biochemical subroutines in the body. So what the polyphenols do, they have this really interesting dual anti-inflammatory mechanism. They do they downregulate the genes that code for matrix metalloprotease enzymes. And that's important because these are the enzymes at the bottom of the cascade that actually destroy the extracellular matrix and lead to the breakdown of tissue. But they also, through a classic enzyme inhibitory effect, they bind to the divalent metal cations that you see in the active sites of these enzymes, and it inhibits them directly. So in the West, we have traditionally not consumed very high levels of polyphenols. So for us, the 6-to-3 ratio is really important. Go to India, China, or Africa, and they're consuming a diet. And if you go there and eat the local food and learn how to cook it, which I always do whenever I travel, you will find they use vast amounts of spices, which contain very high levels of polyphenols. And so if I'm cooking an Indian dish, I will use, even in the milder Indian dishes, in one dish, I will use more spice than I would use in a year of cooking Western food.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they're consuming very, very high levels of polyphenols, which means they can get away with much higher 6-to-3 ratios. The problems that they're now facing in these countries is that they're moving away from the traditional diets. They didn't have very good 6-to-3 ratios to begin with. They were compensating for that with the polyphenols, but the polyphenols are being stripped away too now. And they are undergoing a public health catastrophe. China and India, it's absolutely overwhelming their ability to cope. And the young kids who've moved to the cities, who've left the traditional diets behind, working in IT and call centers or whatever it is they're doing, they're eating junk food, Western junk food, and they're dying before their parents.
Yeah.
So yes, the 6-to-3 is important. It's not the whole story.
No, but that is very interesting, and it is quite shocking when you hear the effects of the westernized diet. You know, when it travels to places where they haven't been exposed before, it can be quite significant. We've got so used to it as part of our diet, we don't see the effect it has. But when it's introduced to a new population, it really should make us all reflect on what we do eat. We've got going back to the questions with regards to the question about fasting. We've got a little bit more of an explanation. Yes, so we were looking for fasting, and they were speaking about fasting, which helps in cell apoptosis and getting rid of aging cells. I don't know if that makes sense.
There's different ways of getting rid of aging cells. You don't have to fast to do that. There are a growing list of senolytic compounds, some of which are synthetic, but we're seeing more and more of them coming from the natural sector as well. And you can use those to get rid of aging cells if that's something that concerns you. And you don't have to fast in order to do that. Mm-hmm. Fasting, of course, switches on, it phosphorylates AMP kinase, leading to the downregulation of mTOR, and that seems like a good thing to do, generally pro-health. One of the ways in which you switch AMPK on, of course, classically is through taking physical exercise, whether it's aerobic or whether you're pulling on rubber bands and springs, and you can do all that. But you can also achieve the same end result by eating damaranes and certain polyphenols. You can switch on AMPK in just the same way, and these are effectively exercise in a capsule. They have the same effects on the body. One of the ways in which they do so is they upregulate these autocoidal proteins called cestrins. And cestrins are members of a larger group of stress response proteins, which together cumulatively they're known as alarmins. And there's antimicrobial proteins, heat shock proteins, you're probably more familiar with.
Yeah.
And by switching them on, what you're actually doing is you're giving the body an acute stress, which upregulates its stress responses and makes it better able to cope in the long haul. We used to call these adaptogens, we now call them xenoaromatics. And so fasting, you can think of as it has some of those types of effects, and we all know that calorie restriction, people live a bit longer if you can restrict your calories for long enough, and most people can't do that. But in fact, exposing your body to different types of stress on a fairly regular basis, it all has the same effect, whether you're fasting, whether you're going through cold exposure, or whether you're visiting the sauna and going through that heating cold cycle. They all, at the end, they seem to be working through the same final common pathway. And so, although I know that people are very interested in fasting at the moment because so many people are overweight and obese, to get those types of health benefits, you can use a different set of keys to achieve the same end results.
Which often may be more behaviorally easier than attempting to fast, which I know from a lot of the patients I speak to, they can struggle with keeping up a consistent fasting routine. So as you say, there could be better ways to achieve the same end goal, so I hope that answers your question. We've actually got two more questions, if you don't mind, I'd like to put to you. They're from Dr. Matthew Lee, who is interested in preventative medicine. So his first question is, he wanted to ask about your experience with nutrigenomics, and if we know about any of its current capabilities and limitations.
Okay, this is such a hot topic.
Yes, I can imagine it's got we could talk about this for a whole webinar of its own, I would think. But
well, listen, thank you for this question. And it's a question that a lot of companies in this space would love to make money by answering. I'm not that yes, I mean, we know that there are differences. We know that some people are salt sensitive, others not. Some people respond to omega-3s in one way, others don't. And we are beginning to tease out what some of the genetic factors are. But I go back to the Blue Zone data. First of all, the type of personalized nutrition that nutrigenomics implies, it's intensive, it's expensive, and I don't think it's a way to address public health. It's a way to address private patients who can afford this type of intervention. If you want to interfere at the public health level, which is where I focus, I go back to the Blue Zone data, as I said, and I go back in particular to one of the Blue Zones, which I co-discovered with Judith Robotham, who is a wonderful historian of the 19th century. And this is the mid-Victorian period in England. This has all been characterized and written up in a number of different journals, and it's actually been it was very heavily criticized when they came out, but it's now being increasingly cited because what we were able to show, and other people have since, is that you had there a population who had exemplary nutrition. They were better than the Mediterranean diet. And the result of that was that they had a life expectancy that was pretty close to ours. If you do strict comparisons between identical socioeconomic groups, their life expectancy matched ours, but their health expectancy was far greater. This is a time when the doctors are beginning to become semi-civilized process, which is still not complete in my view. And they can't actually do much for their patients. So what they do to make themselves look professional is, first of all, they chase all the herbalists and wise women out of town. But the second thing is they do lots of autopsies. And even your humble country doctor is doing 2, 3, maybe 4 autopsies a week. And they become really, really good pathological anatomists. And Judith and I went through thousands of these reports. And I have to say that they didn't enter the details into Excel or,
no.
you know.
I imagine it was quite the task.
But they really got very, very good at what they were doing. And they couldn't diagnose these chronic degenerative diseases as early as we do, but they could and did diagnose them at the point of death without prejudice. And when you look at these records, you can see that cancers and circulatory diseases, which everybody knows they're responsible for about 2/3 of deaths today. In that population, they are responsible for about 6% of deaths. And what we think that means is 2 things. Firstly, it means that about 90% of the enormous burden of non-communicable degenerative ill health that we see today, we think about 90% of it is avoidable if the food companies took responsibility for what they did. But secondly, that 10% is really interesting. It's 10% at that time had the diseases of the numbers we see today. You ask anyone who specializes in oncology or cardiology or who's a neurogeriatrician, how many of your patients have strong genetic risk factors? And they'll say about 10%. The answer is always the same. So I think the conclusion that we drew was that in the 19th century, in this population that was so superbly nourished, that it was only those people who had these strong genetic risk factors. And I think we know about 50 or 60 fairly strong genetic risk factors, maybe more now. But it's only that subset who developed those types of diseases. Everybody else was protected. Mm-hmm. The lesson for me that I draw, the conclusion that I draw is if we really want to change public health, nutrigenomics is actually quantitatively only 1/10 as important as getting your basic population nutritional profiles right.
Yeah, well, I think that's it. It's a great answer to the question, because as you say, you need to start at the widest part of the funnel at the top, don't you, with public health to inform the greatest number of people. And as you say, nutrigenomics may have a part to play in the one-on-one individualized treatment program. The other question from Dr. Matthew Lee was, he's asked, given the increasingly large burden of costs in emergency interventions, has the NHS taken any steps to implement any aspect of pharmaco-nutrition or nutrigenomics?
Of course not.
Yeah, I think it's a wishful thinking, as he puts, to create a shift towards disease prevention.
Well, they pay lip service to the idea, but the bulk of medical training at medical school is pharmacocentric. And of course, a lot of the post-qualification training that doctors get is provided to them courtesy of the pharmaceutical reps as well. I mean, not exclusively. But the model that we are taught, the model that is largely practiced, is still profoundly pharmacocentric. We're still trapped in this historical construct, which was extremely appropriate at the time when von Leeuwenhoek and Domash and Pasteur, when they sort of laid in stone the foundations of that pharmaceutical model. It was absolutely correct when you're dealing with microbes, because you can kill the microbe without killing the man. Magic bullets work in that context. And what it has done, it has created a model of medicine, of medical teaching, medical practice, and of course the other stakeholders, the pharmaceutical industry, who make sure that it runs within those narrow rails, but they are the wrong rails. We're pointing our guns in the wrong direction. We can treat the symptoms of the people who come to us, but the increasing numbers who are flooding into the surgeries are being driven there because we've forgotten the nutritional wisdom of our great-grandparents. And that's where we have to go if we want to be genuinely preventative. And I would always think of John Snow, not that poxy newsreader, but the father of epidemiology, the great John Snow, who, unlike the other doctors who were running around with their plague masks and bleeding and purging and generally hurting people, he had the wit to look around and map out where these cases were occurring. And this absolute genius, this staggering genius, he was able to conclude somehow that this must be the epicenter. And he went down to the well. Everybody knows this story where the contamination had occurred. He took the pump handle off the well and resolved the issue. This is what we must do now. We need a new Jon Snow. I'm not him. I'm not an activist. I'm really much too old for that now. And I'm happier in the library and than on the front lines. But that's the kind of person that we need now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a fantastic answer. I hope that answered your question, Dr. Lee. But you're absolutely right, Dr. Clayton. I think that we've got the science and we're understanding the science, but it's how we get that science across to the majority and within to the public health and within to our policies within our respective countries that is the next stage, which hopefully. As we move forward and science moves forward, that will be the way that we see health develop. But all of us as clinicians that are listening, at least we can start to begin our part by consulting with our patients and applying the science to the way that we practice, whether we're in NHS services or our own private practice as well. One of the last things I wanted to ask about as we draw to a close this evening was, and you touched on it ever so briefly in your beginning discussion, was talking a bit about the gut microbiome, because I think this is another thing that is extremely a hot topic at the moment. I think it gets mentioned a lot in the medical press, but also in the public domain. And I know that lots of patients spend a lot of money on buying probiotics and maybe not really understanding the benefits in. So I wondered if you could just share a little with us about the importance of managing the gut microbiome and how you see we can make the most difference there.
Well, it's very difficult for me to comment on the efficacy of the probiotics because I think by and large they're not particularly effective. Mm-hmm. And that's reflected to some extent in EFSA's current position. I mean, they are starting to toy with the idea of at least allowing the term probiotic to be used, but the idea of allowing claims to be attached to them is still quite a long way off. And that's frankly because the evidence isn't that good. Mm-hmm. And when you think about what's actually going on here, it's not surprising because when you take a probiotic supplement, no matter how many CFUs there are in the capsule or in the kefir or the kombucha, you're sending in very, very small numbers compared to the vastly greater numbers of microbes that are already colonizing the intestine. It's a very densely colonized, very complex environmental space. And all these other species that are down there are all fighting their own corner. It's like urban warfare in there. I mean, there are alliances, there are areas of competition, there are outright wars between the different species. Mm-hmm. And I talked briefly before about the fact that we've reduced our intake of prebiotic fibers. It's now about 2.5 grams a day on average, which is really minuscule. Yeah. Which leads to a proliferation of gram-negative bacteria because most of the bugs that like to eat these prebiotic fibers, most, not exclusively, but most of them are gram-positive. Mm. So gram-negatives, many of them like to eat mucin, destroy the mucosal layer, come into contact with the gut, lots of inflammation because LPS, for those of you who know their medical history, that was the active substance in Coley's toxins. Do you remember those?
Goodness, yes, yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, which is really a kill or cure approach. And actually he did cure some of his cancer patients, but he killed a lot more. So I don't recommend this.
No. Absolutely, yeah.
So too many of these in the gut and you will have chronic inflammatory problems. So what you do is you restore a pre-transitional microbiome by increasing the amount and the variety of prebiotic fibers that you eat. Now these are, structurally speaking, they're carbohydrates, but they're non-digestible. And so examples are phos and inulin and 1316 beta-glucan, 1314 beta-glucans, resistant starch, but there's quite a lot of others. Mm-hmm. There's arabinogalactans, which I find quite interesting. But you need a blend of those with different chain lengths and different fermentation rates. Because once they arrive in the large bowel, the rate of fermentation determines where in the large bowel they will start to shift the microbiome from gram-negative towards gram-positive. Now, the bugs that like to eat these fibers, in order to get access to them, they have discovered that the best place for them to be is in the lumen of the gut.
Okay.
So that's where they stay, because that's where they want their food.
Yeah.
The gram-positive bacteria also contain compounds in their cell walls that could also cause inflammatory stress, like lipoteichoic acid and flagellin and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But because they're wanting to get the prebiotic fibers, they stay in the lumen, so they don't come into contact with our colonocytes to nearly the same extent. But they do something else. As they break down these carbohydrates, they break them down into short-chain fatty acids, including acetic propionic and third, last but not least, butyric acid, which is a powerful anti-inflammatory agent.
Yeah.
It's not only anti-inflammatory, it's very good at triggering apoptosis in a range of cancer cell lines. So the more of these fibers you eat, the more your microbiome, technically microbiota, shifts towards these probiotic species. And now we're seeing wholesale changes. The less inflammatory the large barrel becomes, and the more chemoprotected it becomes. So that's embedded or embodied, I should say, in another formulation that I put together, which is called Xenobiotic, which actually is probably the product I'm proudest of, because it seems very simple. At face, it's just, a handful of different fiber types, but together, proportions right. It took a long time to get together, right?
Yeah, I can imagine, but I think that's really interesting, because I think it's not an approach that some of us have maybe thought about before. We've all heard about prebiotics and trying to encourage the bacteria by replacing the bacteria directly, but actually, as you say, the value comes far more from the probiotic approach. So
you can get a much greater change, and instead of trying to put foreign bacteria into the gut where they don't colonize. It's a day after you stop taking them, they're gone. You can't see any trace of them. What we're doing is we're sending in supplies to the troops who are already there. They know the terrain, they know you, they're at home there. You're giving them what they want, and now they can start to do their thing and protect you. So it's just a much more effective way of normalizing the situation. And of course, because these are fibers, there's no problem with shelf life. You don't have to refrigerate them. They're actually thermally stable. So you can even take these fibers and you can bake them into breads or biscuits if that's what you want to do.
Okay, so which gives people the option of how to take them as part of their sort of routine. I think one of the other things that just to ask is, obviously the gut, the microbiota has had influence on our immune system as well, which I know, given the COVID pandemic, lots of us have been asked by patients, how can I improve my immune system? How can I have a better defense? And we know that there is some link there, isn't there, as well as, improving patients' nutrition all round.
Absolutely, and there is some evidence emerging that if you have dysbiosis, that you are more vulnerable. The evidence suggests that if you have the wrong type of microbiome, COVID viruses in the gut find it easier to cross the barriers at the colonic epithelium and into the body. But I think that there's more going on than that. I think the story is a little bit more complicated than that, because if you have the right microbiota, you're going to be less prone to pro-inflammatory sequences culminating in cytokine storms, whatever you want to call them. Anyway, I think that the entire program, the government program, the responses to COVID have been politicized and incredibly badly handled. And there's a lot of evidence now showing that the effects of socialization and lockdowns, community dislocation, and all along everything that goes along with that is actually killing more people than are dying from COVID. And it's indicative of a government response that has been driven by the pharmaceutical industry and by their lobbyists rather than by good science. Because the evidence that you can protect yourself against COVID infection using immunologically directed nutritional programming is actually rather good. Think of the time course of COVID infection. You've got a group of 100 people. Along comes the virus. Let's say 50 people actually become infected. Out of those 50, more than half of them won't have any symptoms at all. Of, let's say, 20 end up having symptoms, and probably 18 or 19 of those symptoms are going to be resolved fairly quickly after about a week or 10 days. Only a very small number go on to get seriously ill, and they are almost exclusively over 70, or they have serious comorbidities. heart failure, obesity, diabetes. I mean, we know the drill. If you don't have those, your risk of becoming seriously ill is minimal.
Yeah.
So what does that time course tell us? It tells us everything. Because in that period of 10 to 12 days, when you've got this viremia before it's resolved, which is what happens in most cases, it's the innate immune system that's protecting you. The adaptive immune system doesn't even get its boots on until well into the second week. So how does the innate immune system protect you against viruses? Well, the defense against microbes is predominantly cellular, macrophages, neutrophils. Yeah. The defenses against viruses at that early stage in the innate immune system are largely, not exclusively, but largely chemical. Don't even think about the natural killer cells. They're irrelevant, really, at this point. They're hopelessly ineffective. How does the innate immune system protect against viruses? It has basically the ability to produce several mild oxidants. So hydrogen peroxide is one, hypochlorous acid is another, hypoiodide, and hypothiocyanate ions. And in order to make those ions, and all of them have been shown to degrade COVID viruses to the point where they cannot go through the cell entry replication cycle, you need to have a rather peculiar array of phytonutrients and atypical phytonutrients. And it just so happens when you look at dietary shift over the last century or so, what we see is that our intake of the nutrients that you need to maintain good innate immunity have just, they've plummeted. To just take one example, one of the key enzymes involved here is lactoperoxidase. And lactoperoxidase protects the eyes, the ears, nose, airways, mammary glands, gastrointestinal tract, and one or two other bits and pieces. And it produces hypoiodide and hypothiocyanate ions. And they're documented. There are lots of papers showing these are really, really good at damaging and degrading the COVID virus and many others besides. First of all, this is a ferroprotein. And iron depletion or outright deficiency is the commonest single nutrient, micronutrient depletion deficiency scenario that we see, particularly, we know who the at-risk groups are.
Yeah.
The other thing that this enzyme needs is, well, apart from hydrogen peroxide, which is produced by your macrophages and neutrophils, if they're doing the right thing, for that, you need 1,3,1,6 beta-glucans for them to do their job, and people don't eat those anymore. But then the lactoperoxidase requires iodine and a cyanogen. Population iodine intakes have been in decline for the last 20 years because we haven't maintained population iodine status, a whole range of reasons. People are eating less salt, or they're eating sea salt, which is not iodinated. Yeah. So the enzyme is doubly hampered, and then it's triply hampered because our intakes of cyanogens have fallen as well. Now, there's only a relatively limited number of cyanogenic compounds that used to be in the diet, and they included cyanogenic glycosides, not so important here because that comes from cereals like millet. So that's more of an African and maybe Asian thing. But for us, it was always brassica, glucosinolates. And our intakes of those have declined by probably 70 or 80% over the last 120 years. So this really, really important enzyme is only firing on 1 out of 4 cylinders. Now, we have so much redundancy engineered into us through the evolutionary process that most of us can still stagger by. We can get by even with that level of incompetence. But what I developed Extend specifically to address this issue. And I developed it after the WHO came out with this concept of disease X, which they invented 3 years ago now as a placeholder name for a new emergent virus that combined high transmission rates with high virulence, the Andromeda strain, disease X. And so I thought, well, if we don't know what it is, how can we defend against it? And then I looked at these antiviral defenses and put together a formulation to support every element of the innate immune system. And that's what Extend is. So when the balloon went up and COVID was first hitting the headlines and everyone was terrified, we thought it was going to kill all of us, which was nonsense, of course. The Diamond Princess, which was the first semi-controlled experiment, told us that. And that was in a vulnerable population. So I wasn't too worried, but I was in somewhere in, I was in Siberia, I think at the time. And I knew I had to get back to the United States before international travel was going to be stopped. So I got a ride on a hay cart and then a taxi, and eventually got to Moscow and flew out of Moscow to eventually got to New York. Just I was in one of the last international flights that got into the country. But I really wasn't concerned about COVID, and people were very, very paranoid. They were wearing masks and gloves and spraying everything with antiseptic, and I didn't want to do any of that. So I didn't wear a mask, I didn't wear gloves, I didn't wash my hands, and I got COVID because I really didn't think it was a serious problem.
Yeah.
I had a sore throat, mild sore throat, for about a week, a cough for maybe a slight cough for 2 weeks, but I was never sick enough to have to stop work. It wasn't even as bad as flu. And it was like, I've had worse hangovers, although not since I was at medical school.
Yeah, yeah.
And really, I am, at least theoretically, in a high-risk group. I'm 70 plus. So I really should have got rather sicker than I did. But for me, it was an absolutely trivial experience. Now, this is not science. N equals 1. That doesn't tell us anything at all.
Yeah.
But when I look at the rest of the Zinzino population who are using Extend, and particularly those who've been using the health protocol, no one seems to have got sick at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that given the low cost and safety of pharmaconutritional programs, I think that is I think it's a safer, and I really believe it's a far more effective way at improving public nutrition and thereby providing overall immunity to large populations. Unfortunately, it doesn't make vast sums of money for the pharmaceutical company, their lobbyists, and the politicians who take that source of funding. So, health is political in the final analysis.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's a really nice way to bring us to a close today. Because I think, thank you very much for your discussion. It's been incredibly interesting, and I hope everyone listening has found it really interesting. And I think you've explained beautifully through our discussion about how the health protocol, the Zinzino health protocol, does help us respond to some of the public health issues that we have by looking at it from all those different ways, by attacking the issue from the four horsemen, which again I really enjoyed your analogy, and we can see one of the panelists has said, absolutely, thank you. It's been a really useful webinar. So thank you very much for your time. I think you've given us all some very good food for thought and some good for us to reflect on. Just before we come to it, has anybody got a final question they wanted to add?
I just wanted to send people to my website. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, as you mentioned, your blog is always a fantastic read. So I would recommend everybody to have a look there and read some more about Dr. Clayton's work. And on behalf of everybody, thank you ever so much for your time this evening, or this evening with us, this afternoon where you are. And I think you've inspired a lot of us to do a bit more of our own research and look into things and absolutely talk more to our patients about how pharmaconutrition supplementation can help support their health. So thanks very much, and good evening, everybody. Thanks. Nice to talk to you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey.